The auditorium doors swung open, flooding the entryway with harsh white light and the heavy bass thrum of an opening anthem designed to impress. Inside, the world was dressed in perfection. Polished shoes gleamed beneath tailored trousers. Necklines and ties formed a uniform sea of affluence, punctuated by careful bursts of designer flair, a statement watch here, a gleaming brooch there. The air smelled of expensive cologne, dry cleaning fluid, and the subtle musk of ambition. She stepped inside, the worn soles of her sneakers making almost no sound against the waxed marble. And still, heads turned. Not because they recognized her, but because they didn't. Because she didn't belong in their carefully curated ecosystem. Whispers followed her like smoke. Eyes raked her from head to toe, cataloging every perceived offense against the silent dress code. A canvas tote bag instead of a leather briefcase. Jeans faded at the knees. A blouse clean but simple, bearing no designer's mark. It wasn't hostility that filled the space around her. It was something colder. Dismissal. The kind of reflex that didn't require conscious cruelty, only the quiet, practiced conviction that some people simply didn't matter. She moved forward, each step a small rebellion against the gravity of their contempt. At the far end of the hall, massive digital screens flashed promotional reels, images of mountains scaled, villages built, awards accepted, all celebrating the success stories of the world's brightest, richest, most unstoppable leaders. The woman who had brushed her aside earlier stood with a cluster of executives, laughing too loudly, the brittle sound cracking in the vastness of the room. Her glance swept over the newcomer again, and this time she leaned toward her companions, murmuring something that made them all chuckle behind manicured hands. She heard it. Probably someone from catering. "Poor thing looks lost." The words struck her across the chest like a slap she had long since stopped flinching from. She let them wash over her. Let them fuel the fire already burning in her ribs. She moved past the clusters of polished people, past the welcoming tables and registration booths manned by interns with hollow smiles. No one stopped her. No one asked for her name. They assumed, without thinking, that she didn't matter. That she was invisible. They didn't know that her name was the only one that mattered today. Near the wings of the stage, a young coordinator in a headset caught sight of her and hurried over, cheeks flushed with apology. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, glancing nervously at the gathering crowd. You're the keynote?" She nodded once. The coordinator swallowed hard, her face twisting into an awkward mix of guilt and panic. "Please come with me," she said quickly, leading her backstage without meeting her eyes. Behind the heavy curtains, the space shifted. Stagehands moved with choreographed urgency. Technicians adjusted microphones and lighting rigs. Producers barked into headsets, herding speakers like cattle toward their assigned marks. She stood calmly amid the chaos, her fingers brushing the edge of the podium waiting for her at center stage. It was a good podium. Heavy. Solid. A place meant for voices that mattered. Someone handed her a microphone, eyes darting anxiously between her and the clock counting down to her moment. From the other side of the curtains, the conference host's voice boomed through the speakers. "And now, please welcome our keynote speaker, someone whose journey redefines resilience, innovation, and the future of leadership." There was a smattering of polite applause, the kind reserved for someone important enough to merit clapping for, but not important enough to inspire excitement. Yet, she inhaled once. The coordinator gave her a frantic nod, and she stepped onto the stage. The room's murmur died almost instantly. She could feel the collective confusion ripple outward. The audience stiffened in their seats, trying to reconcile what they saw with what they expected. Where was the polished billionaire in a silk suit? Where was the familiar face from glossy magazine covers? All they saw was her. The girl they had dismissed. The girl they had stepped around. The girl they had judged before hearing a single word. She walked to the podium without hurry. Placed the tote bag gently on the floor beside her. Adjusted the microphone. And then she looked out over the sea of faces frozen in disbelief. When she spoke, her voice didn't tremble. It rang clear, cutting through the cavernous hall, carving space for itself among the doubts and preconceptions. "Good morning," she said. A simple beginning, but enough to shift the room. Because already, some were leaning forward, not because they recognized her, but because something in her voice made it impossible not to listen. And she had barely begun. For a moment after her simple greeting, silence clung to the auditorium like a held breath. She could feel it, the tension of an audience unsure whether to lean in or turn away. The confused buzz of their minds ticking through possibilities, trying to make sense of her presence. She let the pause stretch, allowed the discomfort to settle in their bones. Because discomfort was fertile ground. It broke through the hardened soil of assumptions and made people listen in ways comfort never could. She smiled a small, patient curve of her lips and began. I was told once, she said, her voice calm but carrying easily to the farthest corners of the room, that leadership belongs to those who are born into the right families, who speak with the right accents, who walk into a room and are recognized without having to earn it. Several heads in the audience tilted subtly like dogs hearing a strange sound. She continued. But what they forget, she said, stepping out from behind the podium now, her hands moving naturally, is that leadership doesn't care about pedigree. Her sneakers squeaked lightly against the polished stage floor as she moved, a sound so stark against the usual glide of dress shoes that it commanded attention. Leadership, she said, pacing slowly, belongs to the ones who survive what others never see. To the ones who rebuild from nothing. To the ones who walk into rooms like this, rooms not built for them, and stay anyway. She watched as the front row shifted uncomfortably. Men and women in expensive suits glanced at each other, silently recalibrating their expectations. You see, she said, voice warming, deepening, I didn't arrive here today because someone opened a door for me. She stopped center stage, feet planted firmly, gaze sweeping the sea of faces before her. I arrived because every door I reached for was slammed in my face. She told them about sleeping on couches, studying under flickering streetlights when libraries closed and no one cared to extend their hours for kids like her. About working 2 jobs while finishing a degree everyone said was pointless. About hearing, you don't belong here, whispered behind her back and sometimes shouted straight to her face. And then she told them how she stayed anyway. How she built programs that taught entrepreneurship to kids who'd never even been in a bank. How she helped communities fund themselves when traditional investors turned away. How she learned not just to survive the rooms that rejected her, but to change them. You think success looks like a trophy, she said, voice steady. You think it wears a tailored suit and drives a car so sleek it doesn't leave tracks. She leaned in, letting her voice drop into a near whisper that forced the entire auditorium to lean forward to hear her next words. But real success, she said, looks like a girl carrying her whole future in a canvas tote bag. It looks like walking through doors meant to keep you out and building new doors for those who come after you. The silence now wasn't awkward. It was electric. The room had forgotten to check their phones. Forgotten to glance at their watches. They were pinned to their seats by the gravity of her presence, by the undeniable truth that radiated from her words. She straightened slowly, letting them absorb the weight of her story. Some of you, she said, lifting her chin slightly, won't remember my name when you leave this room. You'll remember my shoes, my tote bag, my face that didn't match your assumptions. A few chuckles rippled nervously through the crowd, half shame, half admiration. And that's fine, she said, voice firm. Because tomorrow, when someone steps into your space who doesn't fit your polished mold of success, you'll hesitate. You'll remember that leadership doesn't announce itself in the ways you expect. It arrives quietly. It walks in sneakers. It speaks in accents you once thought were unworthy. And if you're wise, you'll listen. Her final words landed like stones dropped into a still pond, sending ripples out through every corner of the vast hall. She stepped back to the podium, placed the microphone carefully into its holder, and simply said, "Thank you." There was a beat, a heartbeat's worth of stunned, breathless stillness. And then the applause came, not polite, not automatic, real. It started with a single person rising to their feet, then another, and another, until the room, the same room that had dismissed her when she walked through its doors, now stood for her. Not because they had been told to, because they had been changed. And at the back of the hall, leaning against a column, the woman who had shoved her aside earlier watched, arms crossed tight across her designer dress, her mouth set in a hard, trembling line, because she realized, too late, that the girl she had called poor didn't just belong here. She owned the stage they thought belonged to them. The applause faded, but the echoes of her speech clung to the air long after the auditorium emptied. She moved through the afterparty like a ripple through still water, heads turning, voices dropping to hushed tones as she passed. Some approached her openly, hands extended, smiles wide and eager. A few offered genuine praise. A few recited rehearsed compliments, hoping to catch the shine of her moment. And some, many more than she could count, kept their distance, whispered behind champagne flutes, pulled their inner circles tighter, measured her not by what she had said, but by what she threatened. A shift in the delicate, invisible balance of power. Because power, she knew wasn't just held by titles or trophies. It lived in networks, tightly woven, jealously guarded, passed from one familiar hand to another under the illusion of merit. And now she had upset the pattern. She saw it happen first in the cluster near the balcony doors. A group of polished men, expensive watches flashing under the chandeliers, laughing a little too loudly, their eyes darting toward her when they thought she wasn't looking. She caught snatches of their conversation, half mocking, half defensive. Impressive for someone like that. Good story, sure, but leadership's about more than speeches. She won't last once the real work starts. The words didn't sting. They sparked something sharper. Because she had expected this. Disruption was celebrated on stage, and quietly resisted the moment the lights went down. They didn't fear her words. They feared what her presence implied. That the gates they had built weren't as sturdy as they once believed. The offers she received afterward revealed the shape of their fear. Invitations to speak, but only at youth summits and diversity panels. Never at board meetings or strategy retreats. Job offers, but always as a consultant. Never as a decision maker. Opportunities, but with invisible ceilings pressed firm against them. They wanted her story. They didn't want her power. It would have been easy, seductive even to accept. To smile. To nod. To be their symbol. Their proof of progress without actually shifting anything fundamental. But she hadn't climbed here, hadn't survived, to become anyone's mascot. Late that evening, tucked into a booth at a diner miles from the polished floors of the summit, she spread the contracts across the sticky table and read them carefully. One after another, she set them aside. Too limiting, too performative, too safe. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a notepad full of crossed-out dreams, refilled her coffee without asking. "You one of them fancy conference folks?" the waitress asked, nodding toward the name badge still clipped to her tote. She smiled, real and unguarded, for the first time all day. "Something like that," she said. The waitress laughed, a warm, worn sound. "Good," she said. "They need someone real up there for once." The words struck deeper than all the applause combined, because they reminded her. She wasn't here to be accepted by the old network. She was here to build a new one. One not based on whispered connections and inherited privilege. One rooted in shared struggle, in earned wisdom, in voices that had never before been allowed to rise together. She gathered the contracts, folded them neatly, and slid them back into her bag. Tomorrow, she would start reaching out. Not to the glossy names who clung to their crumbling thrones, but to the unseen builders, the overlooked fighters, the dreamers stitching new blueprints in the shadows. She would find them. She would amplify them. She would make it impossible for the old network to pretend they were invisible ever again. Because real leadership didn't squeeze into spaces that were never meant to hold it. It broke them open, and she was just getting started. She didn't start with money. She didn't start with endorsements or glossy brochures or corporate seed funding carefully doled out to preserve old hierarchies. She started with a table. A battered folding table in the corner of a community center that still smelled faintly of bleach and hope. On a Saturday morning, while most of the city slept off expensive cocktails and late-night deals, she set out coffee in paper cups and arranged mismatched chairs in a loose circle. No banners, no stage lights, just an open door. And an idea. Word traveled faster than she expected. Not through press releases or curated social media blasts, but through texts passed between friends, whispered invitations after late shifts, graffiti scrawled quietly on the corners of forgotten neighborhoods. "You need to hear her. She's one of us. She's building something new." They came hesitantly at first. Students, single mothers, artists scraping together rent between commissions, young men and women whose resumes were full of talent but thin on luck. They brought folding chairs from their cars, notebooks worn thin, and questions they were tired of asking into empty rooms. And she listened. That was the difference. She didn't come with prepackaged answers. She didn't promise to save them. She asked, "What do you need? What have you never been allowed to build? What future would you create if someone just gave you the tools instead of permission?" And then, together, they began. They mapped out networks that didn't rely on pedigree, but on merit. Built business plans designed not to maximize profit for distant investors but to circulate wealth within overlooked communities. Created mentorship pipelines where experience was valued over connections, resilience over credentials. They pooled what they had: laptops with missing keys, spaces they could borrow for free, volunteer hours carved out between survival jobs, and spun it into something real. She moved through every meeting, every gathering, with the same worn canvas tote and the same calm certainty she had carried onto the summit stage. Her leadership wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in the way she remembered everyone's names, in how she showed up first and left last, how she stayed when others moved on. The platform grew not because she chased headlines, but because she chased solutions. When funding was needed, she didn't knock on the gilded doors that had once slammed shut in her face. She crowdfunded one small donation at a time, each dollar carrying the weight of 1,000 "you're not good enough" finally overturned. When expertise was needed, she didn't hire PR firms or consultants fluent in buzzwords. She asked the janitors who had fixed their own homes after natural disasters, the street vendors who had built businesses from the ground up with nothing but stubbornness and scrap wood, the grandmothers who had raised generations of leaders without ever being called leaders themselves. Slowly, inevitably, the structure took shape. A living, breathing network built not on exclusion, but on stubborn, radical inclusion. The old networks, the ones that had scoffed and whispered and closed their circles, began to notice. At first with amusement, then confusion, then fear. Because they realized too late that while they had been busy preserving their shrinking castles, she had been building cities outside their walls. One Saturday evening, after a day spent teaching grant writing skills to teenagers and connecting small entrepreneurs with seed investors who actually listened, she sat alone at the community center table. The sunset spilled gold across the scratched linoleum floor. The coffee had gone cold. Her shoulders ached. But she smiled. Because everything around her, every voice amplified, every barrier torn down, had been built without asking permission. Without waiting for a seat at someone else's table. She hadn't just found a place in their world. She had built a new one. And it was just getting started. The first article appeared quietly, a sidebar on a local news website sandwiched between election updates and human interest stories. Grassroots leader redefines entrepreneurship for the overlooked. A photo accompanied it. She stood in front of the community center, smiling slightly, a hand resting on the shoulder of a teenage girl grinning too wide for the camera. The article described the work without romanticizing it. Mentioned the late nights, the minimal funding, the staggering number of participants whose lives had already shifted. She read it once, twice, then folded the paper and pushed it aside. It wasn't why she had started. A recognition, like sunlight, finds you even when you build your garden in the shadows. Within weeks, bigger outlets picked up the story. First regional, then national. Documentary crews called. Podcast hosts sent desperate emails. Magazines once too polished to acknowledge her existence now scrambled to book interviews. They all wanted a piece of her now. Not because they understood. Because they smelled a new trend: authenticity, resilience, the rise of the real. She met every request with the same measured care she had shown from the beginning. Not all visibility was power. Not all exposure was safety. She chose carefully, speaking only with journalists willing to sit through 3-hour conversations about systems instead of chasing viral soundbites. When one glossy magazine asked her to pose draped in designer clothes for a feature titled "The New Faces of Success," she declined without hesitation. "I don't need new faces," she said calmly. "I need new rooms." The interviewer didn't know how to respond. She didn't wait for them to figure it out. Instead, she returned to the work. Because every minute spent polishing an image was a minute stolen from building something real. Still, the tide couldn't be held back forever. Her name appeared on conference programs now, but this time not as a token guest or diversity box to check. This time she was listed at the top. Keynote, panel leader, workshop architect. And every time she took a stage, every time she stood under lights she once thought she'd never touch, she carried with her the names and faces of those still waiting for their doors to open. She spoke their stories, not just her own. She didn't soften the truth, didn't round off the rough edges to make the comfortable feel safer. When asked about grit and perseverance, she redirected the conversation back to the structures designed to keep certain people in struggle and others in ease. She didn't let them turn her into a mascot for inspiration. She insisted on being a blueprint for action. One evening, after a particularly charged panel discussion at a major summit, she stood at the edge of a rooftop reception, the city's skyline glittering around her. A woman, the same one who had once told her, "Out of my way, poor girl," approached with a brittle smile, a flute of champagne dangling from manicured fingers. "I guess I underestimated you," the woman said lightly, offering a hand as if the years between them could be wiped away by a single gesture. She looked at the hand, then at the woman's eyes, and smiled not with bitterness but with a calm the woman would never understand. "You didn't underestimate me," she said. "You only saw what you wanted to see." She turned before the woman could reply, her sneakers soft against the expensive stone, her tote bag, the same battered one, slung over her shoulder. Because she didn't need their approval. She didn't need their handshakes. The recognition she received now wasn't a prize they could bestow or withhold. It was the inevitable result of work done honestly, stubbornly, without compromise. And she knew better than anyone that the truest power wasn't being celebrated by those who once doubted you. It was walking past them without needing anything they had to offer. The seasons turned. Summer bled into fall, leaves loosening their grip on the city's trees, streets dusted with the brittle gold of change. Her name kept circulating in headlines, in boardrooms, in conversations spoken carefully behind closed doors. Some wanted to celebrate her. Some wanted to contain her. None could ignore her. But she remained the same. Each morning, she pulled on worn jeans and comfortable sneakers, slung her canvas tote over her shoulder, walked into rooms still built by old hands and old rules. And every day, she chipped away at those walls. She didn't burn them down in spectacular flames. That was the fantasy the old world feared, the excuse it used to fortify itself. She dismantled them brick by brick with steady hands and relentless presence until one day people looked around and realized the walls were gone and hadn't even noticed the moment they fell. She didn't demand seats at their tables anymore. She built longer tables, wider rooms, opened new doors without asking permission. And the people who had waited too long for someone to make space for them, the students, the dreamers, the workers who carried entire communities on their backs, they came. They came not because they were invited, but because they understood. This space was theirs too. One evening, she stood at the back of a converted warehouse where her team, a growing network of grassroots leaders, had hosted a summit that wasn't about status or optics but about strategy, about real solutions for real people. No velvet ropes. No VIP sections. Just ideas being traded like currency. As the crowd buzzed around her, laughing, debating, connecting, she felt it settle into her bones, that heavy, beautiful truth. This wasn't her movement. It was everyone's. She had simply been the first to refuse to wait. A little girl from nowhere, once told to move aside, now standing in a room filled with people who refused to be moved. At one point, someone handed her a microphone, asked if she wanted to say a few words to close out the night. She shook her head, smiled. "No," she said. "They're saying enough already." Because leadership wasn't about hearing your own voice fill a room. It was about making sure others could hear themselves, maybe for the first time. She slipped out into the night alone, the din of the warehouse fading behind her. The stars winked through a misty sky, the air sharp with the coming winter. She walked through the streets where she once used to wonder if she'd ever be more than a shadow in someone else's success story. Now she understood she was never meant to blend into the backdrop. She was meant to be the one who changed the story altogether. And the best part? She was only getting started. Because the world she had been told didn't exist, a world where leadership wore every color, spoke in every accent, rose from every street corner, was already here. She had built it. With her own hands. With her own stubborn, brilliant, unapologetic heart. And tomorrow it would grow bigger still.